Hi everyone, welcome to Joy of Languages. I'm Katie and I'm here today with Tim Keeley, who is a professor at, now you may need to help me with the pronunciation of this one, Tim. So at Kyushu Sangyo University, is that right?
Very good, perfect.
And Tim is a prolific language learner. So I know this question can be a little bit tricky sometimes, but how many languages do you speak, more or less?
I think you need to look at my presentation on the numbers game. And
I can put a
that's
link to
a
that.
difficult question, but let's say tough. It depends what you call language, what you call dialect, and distinction between active and passive, and many other factors. But I use a dozen or so professionally in teaching and lecturing. Mainly in Japanese, but also Chinese, Thai, and other Asian languages too. And I've studied, and worked in, about a dozen languages, and I can converse pretty well in a couple of dozen, and I can understand the gist of conversations or even the news at times in, let's say, high 30s, low 40s, something like that.
Wow.
But if you want to really know, you have to look at my presentations because it's complicated.
Yeah. I'll put a link to that in the notes of the interview.
Okay.
So, as well as being a prolific language learner, Tim is also a researcher, which is what we're here to talk about today. And particularly some recent research that you've been doing on how a person's personality can affect their ability to learn a language. There was something that you found about something called emotional resilience, which is that people who have this emotional resilience tend to be better at learning languages. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about what is emotional resilience and why does that help people learn languages better?
Okay. First, let me say that the category emotional resilience, it was created by Kozai Group. And the Kozai Group focuses on uh, identifying the personality factors, attitudes, which might facilitate or hinder working in a different culture. So I took those with their permission, they worked with me to test if they also affect uh, somebody's ability to learn to the point where they can approach a native speaker in terms of the way they speak. Okay, so you have to have all the study, but sort of talking about accent and prosody and body languages, the way they communicate, things like that.
Yeah, so prosody, just to clarify then, prosody is like intonation and rhythm. Is that right?
Right, exactly. Right. Okay. So all right, so this is there's a scale of questions that you use to measure it. And it measures your level of emotional strength and your ability to cope favorably with irritations, setbacks, frustrations, and failures, and also how quickly you can recover from emotionally challenging situations. So I think it's best maybe if I give you three sample questions. So three sample questions. First one, or statements, and you say, totally agree or totally false, in your case. It takes time to get over a particularly stressful experience. Okay, obviously, if you said yes, choose 5 on the scale, let's say, then that's indicating that you have low emotional resilience. Next, I find that little things often bother me. Again, a yes answer, low. I have never been good at coping with negative emotions. Okay, again, low in ability. High scores have the ability to respond to with most this emotional resilience to very challenging and frustrating situations, and they can recover quickly from negative experience. While low scores they find extremely difficult to handle psychologically and emotionally challenging situations, and it takes them a long time to fully recover. Yeah. Is we okay so far?
Yep, I'm with you.
I could go into the neurobiology of emotional resilience. Is that okay?
Yeah, so if you can, yeah, absolutely. I'll stop you if there's anything that I'm unsure about, because maybe the people at home might be unsure about it as well. But yeah, let's give it a go.
Okay, so first of all, we're going to talk about the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped structure in the brain. Its name comes from Greek for almond. And like most brain structures, there's two of them. And it's part of the limbic system, which is involved with emotions and reactions to stimuli like fear, like when fear can cause flight, etc. You react very quickly. Your brain sort of shuts down so that you can protect yourself. So the amygdala is a processing center that's hooked up to incoming messages from our senses and our internal organs also. And it's highly involved with different emotional responses. How you react to stress, how you react to something that might cause fear, etc. Okay, good so far?
Yep, I'm with
Okay,
you.
well, now next, the left prefrontal cortex sends inhibitory signals to calm it down, quiet it down. When you have negative feelings like disgust, something disgusting or horror or anger or fear, something like that happens and you react. Okay, so at that moment, the prefrontal cortex is saying, okay, should I calm it down so you don't do anything rash? So now, people with less activation in certain zones of the prefrontal cortex, they have longer activity by the amygdala when they experience some negative emotions. It affects them longer. And so it also determines how quickly you recover.
So am I right in thinking as well? So the amygdala is more kind of related to like knee-jerk reactions, whereas the prefrontal cortex is more related to more measured, logical thought and behavior. Is that right?
Well, exactly. The prefrontal cortex is an inhibitory function, so that if somebody doesn't react on their first responses, like they see a lot of money or go and grab it, or a lot of food, so that desire that comes, it can also, doesn't have to be a negative thing. And so, yeah, it has an inhibitory function so that you can think about it, count to 10 before you do something. If you have low activity in this prefrontal cortex itself, or you don't have enough connections between the left prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, you're going to, have a low emotional resilience. Okay, so, and people who can recover quickly, okay, they have strong connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So you have fright, and then, oh, do you stay frightened for minutes, for hours, or just something, and then they take everything in perspective and they're calm again. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Great.
So that's the background.
Yeah. And so how does this all relate to people who have emotional resilience and their ability to learn languages?
Okay. It relates in many different ways, but it's the strongest when we're talking about acquiring the language, the target language, in the culture where it's spoken. Okay, because in that interaction you have more emotional stimuli. I'm not talking about sitting down and studying a language alone. I'm talking about interaction. So so emotional resilience is associated with maintaining a positive attitudinal states, first of all. So it could be in the case of studying on your own in a sense, because you keep your attitude positive. And it's also related to the learner's attitude towards the target language and users of the language, and with your emotional responses. So, for example, if you develop negative attitudes towards the target language, the culture of the target language, or its native speakers, this can expect it to lower motivation to acquire the language. And importantly, in this case, what we're measuring is to mimic the communicated behavioral traits of native speakers. What does that mean? That means, okay, the pronunciation, um, the intonation, the prosody, the gestures, everything. Okay.
Right.
Now, I think the next point is that emotion underlies most, if not all, cognition, conscious thinking, all cognition. Okay. Well, cognition is just not kind of thinking we're thinking about, but includes that all cognition. So it's part of the learning process because fundamentally, the amygdala assesses the motivational significance and the relevance of what you're perceiving. And it also functions on this basis, it functions to allocate the brain's attention and many resources to various problems. Okay, and the variability of such affects learning. You follow me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So when something is emotionally relevant, salient, we're going to turn attention to it, positive or negative. We're going to turn attention to it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, another aspect is that, as I said, it represents the degree which we are able to overcome, negative experiences and feelings, and how long it takes. So, therefore, coping potential in the foreign language learning process. Because if you have a negative experience interacting with somebody in the language, you're struggling with it, or maybe you speak it for a long time, but you just somebody's critical of you, and you feel down, and you do a YouTube recording of you speaking a language, you get a lot of negative comments, things like that. Okay. um because we face a lot, setbacks and such, and which are judged as negative in terms of how they affect our you know uh,
Yeah.
homeostatic or social static regulation. Homeostatic regulation means keeping the body in a nice, calm state, and keeping our social interaction into a way where we're not getting nervous or feeling anxiety.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Now,
we've talked about a few things then. So we talked about emotional resilience in terms of your ability to bounce back and to cope with difficult situations. We also talked about your attitude towards the language and the culture, and then also your experience, the experience that you've had
yeah,
where you've
your
had.
experiences with learning the language, interacting in the language, your experience with the native speakers of the language,
Yeah.
etc. Okay, so let's go back to explaining why it's has a positive effect on learning a language. Not just learning, performing in the language more than anything else. Okay, when we say learning, if people are thinking just about learning how to conjugate verbs in Italian and the syntax, no, not talking about that at all. I'm talking about actually speaking Italian, especially in all types of social situations, which there might be stress, etc. Okay.
Yeah, which I think at the end of the day is what most people are interested in. I think that's really the thing that people are looking at when they're learning a language, is the ability
Okay.
to.
So if you're learning a language and interacting people, it's important to maintain positive emotional states, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So it affects your ability to adapt to the culture and acquire the language. And positive emotional states facilitate positive evaluations of the stimuli. In other words, what you're feeling, what you're interacting with. Okay. While negative emotional states cause the negative emotions to arise. Okay. So people function much better when they are in a positive emotional state compared to a negative one. So that's a very important part of it.
What do you think it means for a person who's learning a language and their day-to-day life in terms of practicing speaking? So the skills that you mentioned in terms of, or the characteristics, things like emotional resilience, do you think people can develop these? And if so, would this help them in their language learning? Would this help them when learning a language?
Definitely they can develop emotional resilience. And the first thing is awareness. We say, okay, what's making me feel uncomfortable? Okay. And then what could I do to reduce this anxiety? And so because I can't give a pat answer that everybody can use. There's no silver bullet, because you create your own problems, you have to solve them. But first thing is noticing them and then thinking about, oh, I feel some anxiety or uncomfortable and something is bothering me. And keep in mind that when the amygdala is active, it's taking let's call it it's taking a brain activity or energy or space or whatever you want to say. It's blocking the normal function of your brain in terms of the higher functions. Okay, so the ability to carry out higher functions such as speaking a foreign language well. Okay, so a little bit of anxiety is okay. It might push you to watch yourself, make sure push yourself to be motivated, but a lot, no, neurologically, it makes it impossible to perform well. Okay, so we consider also any situation which causes some anxiety, like talking in public or talking to someone who intimidates you, or doing an activity where you feel incompetent. So, like language learning, maybe you feel a little bit incompetent in a certain language. Okay, so we can try it, and then, but before we do it, we can think about, why are we anxious about doing it, and what's the worst thing that could happen? So you put it in perspective, okay? Because when you shut the higher functions down, you imagine all these crazy things which will never happen. So you put it in perspective, and okay, so you monitor your reaction, see how you feel, why do you feel that way, what's the root of the anxiety, where's it coming from? Yeah, you can talk to someone you feel comfortable with about these things, and so that you hear yourself talk.
Yeah.
Not in order to get the other person's opinion, really, just to hear yourself, and then when we explain things that are not completely within our awareness, we usually learn a lot about ourselves from doing it. Okay, we're not aware of why perhaps we get nervous or anxious when we speak this language or talk to this person or in a certain situation. Okay, so we explore it by talking about it with somebody, and maybe they give us input that helps, but it actually really needs to come from yourself. And there's another thing we can do. We can develop ability to reground ourselves, to consciously move from a stressful, anxious, unstable place, unstable ground, and move to a more calm and stable ground to act from. And this is like regrounding. Okay, so
do you also think in terms of emotional resilience, perhaps in terms of keeping going, even though that you're constantly, when you're learning a language, it's definitely good practice in humility, because you're constantly making mistakes, you're constantly coming up against obstacles and difficulty. So do you think it helps in this way as well? And is that something that we
that's what we're talking about. That is the definition of emotional resilience. So how do you basically equals how do you deal with these a frustrating, negative, experience. Frustration is rarely a positive experience. Could
Yeah.
be someone who's a masochist, so I don't know, but yeah, exactly. That's basically the definition of emotional resilience is being able to deal with those kind of states. Um, but let's say that if you want some concrete things to do, I said, okay, you could talk about it, think about it, challenge yourself in a certain situation, come out of that situation. Okay, so let's say that you always feel anxious when speaking Italian with somebody because you think they're always looking to judge, looking for any mistake you might make or whatever. They're going to be critical. You feel judgment in their eye, from their eyes, etc. Okay,
A big
and
problem for language learners.
okay, so if there's a particular person, okay, so we can practice now. We can think beforehand. Well, again, what's the worst that can happen at one and on? And then we can go experience it, and then we can reflect on our experience, and then we can think about how we might, deal with this in the future. You know, once we start to look at, especially the process of thinking, oh, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? Usually, a lot fades away. But when I talked about regrounding, which is more of a set of practices to calm yourself down, just like meditation would be. So you might sit down in a comfortable place and rest and close your eyes and take some deep breaths and concentrate your mind on just your breathing in your body. So kind of like meditation, feel calmer. Now, if you're in a situation of public interaction, it's like taking every moment you can to be mindful of your breathing, how you are sitting or standing. Do you allow the air to flow, or are you somehow restricting it? Things like that. You just learn more about reading your physical signals because your body, your amygdala, takes the signals from the environment as well as your internal organs. So you excite your amygdala. Just you can do it just by physical. Like if you tighten up right now, you can excite it. And if you relax, you calm it. And all these exercises that I'm talking about, this reflection, this mindfulness, etc., actually, what we're looking at in neurobiology is the strengthening of the connections between the left prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So,
And what are your thoughts on practice as well? Because I find sometimes there are some situations where no matter what I do, no matter how much I try to ground myself and breathe and everything, I just find that I don't have emotional resilience in that situation. I'm going to be incredibly nervous the whole time. And, my amygdala is just like going, ah. And I find that the only way to really calm myself down is just by accepting. I guess this comes down to the mindfulness thing, though. So accepting that that's normal, accepting that that's going to happen, not trying to fight it, and then just realizing that actually practice can help me to feel calm in that situation as well. The more I do it, the more I persist, the more calm
step by
I'll feel in situations.
yeah, it's step by step, isn't it? I mean, the next time, as long as you're aware of it and you're considering, you various ways to change it for the better. Okay, I'm going to be mindfulness, and I'm uptight again. Okay, relax, relax. And sometimes it requires disengagement. Just get away. Don't continue at that time, especially if it's going to affect you very negatively. Oh, I'm not going to study this language anymore because you don't want the negative feelings to continue to build up. You want to deal with them. And I mean, I still deal with these things all the time, even though for 44 years, almost every day of my life during the last 44 years, I've been interacting in multiple languages. Never just English. There are very few days in the last 44 years where I just spoke English, and I would say 80% of the days during the last 40 years, I hardly spoke any English. So I've always deal with it, you know. And even if I'm really good at the language, I mean, I lecture in Japanese about many different subjects, cross-cultural management, things we're talking about now, cross-cultural adaptation. I do economics. I do international accounting in Japanese. You know, very wide vocabulary. But sometimes I'll make a bad mistake in Japanese and I'll let it hit me. I realize I just said, especially if it's being recorded, sometimes I'm on video, you know, and I just, oh, that sounds like a beginner's mistake, you know. And
Yeah.
I'm explaining the meaning of a lot of terms and such to, you know, native speakers, but still, you know, just the way I speak, the way I said something, you know, mistakes come. Like it happens in your mother tongue too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really important to realize as well when, especially if someone's just starting out learning a language, because the same happens to me in Italian as well. I've been living in Italy for about 6 or 7 years now, but there are still some situations where, you know, I'll make basic mistakes, or I'll still feel a little bit nervous. So you know, it's not always about trying to fight your nerves, I think, and accepting that at least a little bit is a normal part of learning a
Well,
language,
be careful.
continuing.
Yeah, that word you said fight. So how would you fight it? What do you mean by it? Depends what you
Well,
mean by fight.
yeah, well,
If you mean go get more anxious, like you're actually
yeah.
fighting, fight it by calming down. Just
Yeah,
notice.
exactly. Yeah,
Not
because I
the first step.
sometimes some approaches I think can create some kind of tension. You know, when you're trying not to feel nervous, and then you're like, but now I'm more nervous, and then
Oh
you
yeah,
end up
yeah, yeah. Oh
losing.
yeah, yeah. Exactly, exactly. So you know, by trying not to be nervous, you become more nervous.
Yeah,
You're
that
nervous, you're
happens.
nervous about being nervous, and then you're nervous about being nervous about being nervous, and it snowballs.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah. That's
absolutely.
what I guess you mean by fight. Yeah,
Yeah.
but then
Um,
again, so you can. So a lot of it is you know you can approach it two ways. You see, when you get nervous, you have physiological responses, right? You
yeah.
tighten up and such. Okay. Now, when you go in the opposite direction, even though you don't feel that you should be calm, but you try to make yourself feel calm, you become calm. Also, you may be quite sad, but if you like here and you let your face smile like this for a while, it's very hard to be sad the whole time. You can't be continuously very sad if you're pushing your mouth to smile. Okay, you can push it either way.
Yeah, I've heard about that research actually. Isn't there some research that shows that if you have put a pen between your mouth or something, it makes your brain think that you're smiling and that you're happy? Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. So the same thing is if you become aware of your how the nervousness is not just affecting the way you're speaking. Drop that. Drop that. Don't look at it. Focus on how it's affecting your body. You know how again. You know, eh, am I am I breathing from my abdomen? You know, some people breathe from the chest all the time, and that's you know they have to learn not to do that because you can get quite you know you lose the ability to make yourself calm if you do that. But if you learn to breathe like a baby, you know,
Yeah,
and so you just practice it, and you can get the effect. You know, it can go either way. Mm.
great. And so one other question that I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a little bit about connecting with or feeling an emotional connection with the culture of the language that you're learning and accent. Could you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
So we're not talking about the emotional resilience anymore.
Is it connected because it was part of,
And I would say it's more connected to like emotional sensitivity.
yes, emotional sensitivity, yes, which was another thing that you spoke about
Yeah.
in, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's get into it because I think it will be interesting for people.
Okay. So again, this is another dimension, a personality characteristic that is measured with a scale by the Kozai group. And it measures the capacity to accurately read and comprehend the emotions of others and understand their feelings from their perspective, you know, putting yourself in their shoes. Okay, it also means the ability to listen genuinely, and respond with empathy when people face some challenge or something. All right, now what are the questions that we might use to measure? I'll give you three again. So first one, I am normally sensitive to even the slightest change in the facial expression of the person I'm talking with. Now, yes answer, hi. Before acting, I like to think through how it impacts others. In this case, yes answer, hi again. People often come to me because they feel I am understanding of their challenges and problems. Again, hi. Okay. So we have these type of questions, 10, 12, 14, that relate in one scale. Okay. So again, it's awareness and sensitivity to the emotions and feelings of others. And if you have high emotional sensitivity, you can respond appropriately to somebody's emotional and psychological needs. Now, have you heard the big 5 personality factors?
No.
Okay, well, one of them anyway doesn't matter, is agreeableness. Agreeableness. Okay, and it refers to a pro-social and communal orientation. You want to interact with people, towards others without antagonism, without displaying uh, without displaying some type of negative emotions. Rather, you can display courtesy and tact and empathy and kindness and respect. Okay, so that's agreeableness. I mean, you just meet some people, you just feel negative energy coming at you, and other people immediately you can somehow feel this kind of empathy and kindness and respect, right? Well, that's what we're talking about, that scale there. So it's related to that. Okay. Um, so we can also show tolerance for others. So high scores on this, they're very aware and sensitive to the emotion and feelings of others, and they're highly attentive to how people feel, and they're likely to respond to the correct, with empathy in the correct way. While low scores have little interest. Okay, low score. I don't even need the answer from Donald Trump. Okay, low. Little interest or awareness of how others are feeling. He's always thinking about himself, or what they're thinking. He's always thinking about himself, and rarely attempt to consider the challenges and situations of others. Therefore, the policies. Making this political because it's voting's coming up. Therefore, the kind of policies the Republicans push. Okay, there. Political statement. Go vote. Uh, so let's take a look again at foreign language acquisition in the country. Okay, you went to Italy. Maybe did you study Italian before you got there?
Not really. I tried, but I failed before I came to Italy.
Okay, so you made an effort which you may have frustrated you, so you labeled it failing. Okay, so you basically learned it in country. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about here mainly. Okay, so we we must consider, towards which people a person demonstrates emotional sensitivity, right? Some people, this is very important because we're going to a different culture, different type people. So we are primed as humans, um, to have empathy. Um, okay, first of all, in the early days of our life, by strong attachment, during our early years, the mother, the family, etc. So there's a natural tendency to be emotionally sensitive toward or empathize with those people with whom we identify the most, and often the people who are most like us. Okay, so um, you're asking about identity as identifying with a language or culture. I think in your question, they're leading up to it in a sense. So it can be shown that you have more empathy towards in group, your group of people, than the out group people, the outsiders, right? Like just watch a film, okay? No, go to a movie and watch the people watching a film, and you can notice how they react to what's happening with different characters. If you watch closely, you can guess whom they identify with, right? From their reactions on their face and such. Okay, so um, now this is related to emotional resilience in a way that, well, the emotional sensitivity is the ability to imagine what it's like being that person. You know, put yourself in the shoes, which I spoke about earlier. Okay, and so can you imagine, like in a film, taking the point of view of a character if you do not naturally feel a high degree of empathy toward the character? In other words, there's somebody in the movie, a character, you don't feel that empathy. All right. So then challenge yourself, take their point of view. That's really tough. So it could be in real life too. Okay. So that's what we're talking about. Okay. I'm looking at building this kind of emotional, becoming aware of emotional sensitivity. So when we go to different cultures and different languages, we're dealing with people who might, you know, be different uh, in physical ways or cultural ways, the way they dress, the way they act, etc. Okay, so it's developing the ability to be sensitive to, you know, somebody who's quite different, right? Um, Now, another important thing is really curiosity. So curiosity that, you know, so we can expand our empathy when we get to know people outside our usual social circles, and it exposes us to new ways of thinking, new worldviews. So when you get to know people more deeply, you have a possibility of greater empathy, right? Can you relate to that? Like
Absolutely.
first you don't know them, but once you start to know them, you know, it's like your enemies talk, and then you know they get to know each other, and oh, we're humans, and you know, more
Yeah.
empathy. Okay, so this is how people overcome racial hatred, and also it's a key character strength that can enhance satisfaction in life, curiosity. Okay, and so curiosity is a key character strength, and highly emphatic people that have a lot of people who have a strong emotional sensitivity and identify with the emotions of others. You know, they'll be more rewarded. They'll feel more alive. They'll feel more empowered, and also easier to imitate them. And basically, language is an act of imitation. That's how it's learned. Um, what I Okay, let me give you an example of how you can, you know, challenge yourself. And the best example is George Orwell. Do you know him? Have you heard of
Yeah.
George Orwell? Okay. He wrote a book called Down and Out in Paris and London. And the way he prepared himself, well, first he had this experience. He dressed as a tramp. You know, he lived like the underclass in East London. And so then he recorded his experiences in Down and Out in Paris and London. And it really changed his beliefs, priorities, and relationships. And he developed new friendships and changed his views on inequality. Okay, so in the process of learning a new language and experiencing, you know, associated culture like you are in Italy, we can benefit the same way Orwell did. It can make us more emotional, sensitive to different types of people and people from different cultures. Okay, so how can we develop our emotional sensitivity? Learn more languages, more cultures, right?
Yeah.
Because we're going to get used to identifying with people different in many different ways. Okay, so linguistic, culturally, the way they look, et cetera, the way they think. And the more you do this, you know, people say, okay, it's easier to learn a language after you know quite a few, and they usually focus on cognate languages. Okay, these, you know, and meta linguistic knowledge, so you know how grammar functions and etc. Right? That's one thing. But what I'm talking about today, what you are interviewing me about, is above that, because it's, even though you may know the language in terms of vocabulary and grammar, how do you perform? Do you always sound like an outsider? Is your accent immediately noticeable? I mean, I teach a lot of foreign students here in Japan. So language instruction is in Japanese. The class I have on Wednesday, I require students to constantly raise their hand and, give an answer or give some input. And I have quite a number of foreign students in there. Okay, so I'll just few Vietnamese in the class, for example. I know them, so I know they're Vietnamese. But the moment you hear them, you know they're not Japanese. Just the first two words, okay? And then I called on this one student, was wearing a mask. They do that a lot in Japan. They think they have a cold, or if case of girls, they haven't put on makeup or something, or even the guys have pimples or something, like this. Okay, so I didn't know who it. Just glancing across the room, I didn't know who it was, and she spoke, and then, are you? I said, are you Japanese? Oh, Nihonjin desu ka? Are you Japanese? And then I was, oh no, she's Vietnamese. I said, whoa, very good. Okay, so obviously, what's happening there? There are many, many factors, but this is one of them. This is one of the important ones. It all comes down to identity, personal identity. This all ties together. If you look at my presentations and this whole study I did has identity in there too. But I wrote separate papers on that would take hours to talk about. And I could go on for many, many, many hours showing you the connections and such. And then everybody would turn off your podcast because it's too long.
But it's really, really fascinating. I've found myself what you're talking here about identity and the ability to empathize with the culture and what that means for language skills. I found that personally with different languages. So, for example, when I started learning French, I don't know why I have French friends. There's just something about it that I feel a natural connection to the culture. And the accent, my accent's not perfect because I haven't lived there. I probably haven't spent enough time focusing on it, but people generally comment that my accent in French is quite good. Whereas for Spanish, when I started learning Spanish, I don't know why. I think because it's quite similar to Italian. I didn't really feel an emotional connection to the people or to the language. And it was so much harder to learn. And I struggled with my accent as well.
You didn't want to make Italian jealous.
Yeah.
French was different enough that you could go with, you could have this dual relationship going on,
Yeah.
But Spanish was, looks like your favorite friend there,
Yeah.
close to your favorite friend, and might get jealous,
Yeah, maybe that was it.
No,
But
yeah, and but these are kind of descriptions that sometimes are accurate, I mean, yeah, I experienced with various languages, and also in terms of accent and such, there are times which it's much better than other times, right? Not,
definitely.
it could be today, it could be 2 hours ago, and when you're talking to such a person, you're really feeling it, and you're imitating the way they're communicating, or you're in a party or a group, and you're just, part of it, and you more or less sound like a native speaker. And then something happens later when you have to, do something not as desirable, or it could be any situation, okay? And it's just not coming out, and you just, or people don't authenticate you. People give you that feeling, you're the foreigner, and you have to prove that, you even speak Italian, let alone sound like an Italian, or Spanish or whatever. Okay, so these trigger different levels of identity. And
Definitely.
then that gets back to, this emotional sensitivity and the emotional resilience, because that's a negative experience. So can you overcome it on the spot? How long does it take you to overcome thereafter? And sensitive to your own feelings there. And, and the sense that most sensitivity is awareness of your own feelings too. Yeah. Because especially, as I said, you have to think about, who you are sensitive to, who you identify with, and who you don't, and why. Okay, because you need that identity. Can I discuss a little bit about um, primary language acquisition theory by Tomasello?
Of course, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, um, because this well, I don't know where I could talk about neurons first, mirror neurons, but that might be a little bit take too much time. So let's just say that let's talk about autism. Okay. And that in autism, you often see that there's a communication impairment. So some people depends on what type of autism, etc., the severity. Okay. So what's going on here? Well, of mind. Theory of mind refers to the ability to understand another person's mental state. That's theory of mind, okay? Including their beliefs, their intents, their desires, separate from one's own thoughts and experiences and behavior. That's theory of mind. Okay. Now, this inability to understand others' intentions and behaviors may help to explain why language is delayed in autistic children and why a significant portion of them never acquire language at all. Because Tomasello argument is that the acquisition involves imitation. Okay, he has a social cognitive. So cognitive, the actual thinking of the brain and in a social situation model of acquiring the language. So this type of imitation requires translating another person's actions into one's own, okay, in order to develop in the language as a small child, okay? So it's a process when children first comprehend and use verbal language. It involves understanding the intentions of others. So the most important is joint attention, okay? So you're interacting with somebody and you can direct that, like on a child, you can direct the child's attention a certain way. The child understands what your intentions are. Okay, so it's a very part of it's a part of the prerequisite for a child to really learn language. And so theory of mind thus relates to how we develop language and social communication and the ability to understand others and their intentions and communicate with them. Okay, so the relationship between joint attention and language development, if we look again at autism, one study shows that children with autism they're first assessed at ages between 2 and 6 years old. They took a look at these kids, and then they took a look at them again 8 years later. Okay, what did they learn? Well, the results revealed that one of the strongest predictors of language acquisition development and expressive language abilities was their responsiveness to bids asking for joint attention in the initial assessment. So joint attention is trying to draw a child's attention to something and get them to interact with that, even without language. Okay.
Does that mean so their ability to learn the language was correlated with how they could direct their attention, or how they could
how they could understand the intentions of others, how they could share joint attention.
Do you think that applies to adults possibly in a second language context?
Sure it does, because okay, it's really important in the case of the ability to understand cognate languages. Okay, let's go to the Slavic group. My strongest language is Polish in Slavic languages because I lived there for 2 years, from 1979 to 1981, and I studied Slavic literature. Okay, so I read a lot of Russian at that time, and I've been to the Soviet Union a couple of times before then. Once before then, once thereafter. Okay, but the actual first Slavic language I learned was Croatian, and the first one I ever heard was Slovene. Okay, so now I have Polish, Russian, and Croatian or Serbo-Croatian. I can listen to podcast, and then I studied Slovak before the Bratislava conference, and I've had other study. Okay, but I've gotten to the point where, except for Bulgarian, and Macedonian, okay, I can listen to podcasts on SBS radio from Australia on a variety of subjects. It's really a great source if you want to listen to advanced or upper intermediate listening practice. And follow it. And I understood Slovak the first time I heard it. But you'll get a Pole who says he doesn't understand the Slovak at times. Or people are different ways, right? When it comes to this, whether they understand a language that's quite related to it. So it depends on their tolerance for ambiguity, but it also in interaction with somebody in particular, it depends on this joint attention.
Yes.
The context is created. So I understand what you mean, not just by the words you're saying, but that my attention has been directed in some way and it's been given context. And within this context, I can therefore guess or just assume the meaning of certain words, as I'm listening to it. And so I did this a lot before I went to, Ljubljana, and I was practicing cross-Slavic languages, and yeah, it's something that actually I should say that you develop it more in a personal, in your own face-to-face interaction, okay, actual social interaction. And then my ability to understand it is comes also from the fact that I've had a lot of interaction in these various Slavic speakers, even though I never studied their language. For example, I can remember around 20 years ago when I first heard Slovak and interacted with Slovaks, and we just carried on a conversation. They kept speaking Slovak, and I took Polish and changed it over a bit and used Croatian type past tense endings, etc., and on and on. I was really in tune with what we're talking about, following everything, the context. So so most people are decent at joint attention. Okay, I mean, it's just developing it to a higher level. And so
Yeah.
we are talking about, in this case, to prove the point, we're talking about extremes. So autism, which they have trouble with theory of mind, which means understanding what other people think, identifying with their emotions. Autism is a very emotional issue. Okay, and I stated earlier, all learning is emotional, has an emotional aspect to it. Okay, so we take the extreme example to prove the point of the significance of emotional sensitivity. And emotional sensitivity again is understanding what they're thinking, feeling, etc. All these things, right?
Yeah.
I think the
Thank you.
podcast is too long already, isn't it?
No, it's great. It's brilliant. There's loads of good stuff in there that I think people are going to find really, really interesting. And well, you've certainly given me lots of things to think about anyway, in terms of.
Okay. Can you put the link to the papers or the
Yeah,
paper?
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Just let me know.
If they want to read 62 pages, then they can, see everything I just talked. The main things I just talked about, the harder stuff, in terms of this terminology and all that. Yeah. And more background because actually what I just explained to you is best understood with the background of mirror neurons. So
Perfect. Yeah. So we can put a link to anything in there that you think will help people understand the research, and also because I think it is important, because this is only a small part of a bigger research project that you did, and so it's very useful for people to be able to get the full background if they want to go deeper into this. So I'll put links to your papers. I'll also put links to your talk. And yeah, thank you again. Thanks so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure.